Donald Trump has publicly threatened to impose a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods if Canada proceeds with any significant trade agreement with China. This statement represents a direct linkage between trade policy and national security concerns within North American geopolitical strategy. The threat signals a broader shift toward using economic leverage as a primary tool for managing alliance relationships and containing strategic competitors. We will examine three key areas in this analysis. First, the confirmed statements and policy positions that have emerged from Trump's administration regarding Canada-China trade relationships. Second, the strategic context that drives these concerns, particularly focusing on Arctic security and critical supply chain vulnerabilities. Third, the potential implications for North American economic integration and the broader contest for influence in the Arctic region. The core facts we can confirm are straightforward. Trump has stated that any major trade deal between Canada and China would trigger immediate tariff responses targeting all Canadian exports to the United States. This position has been communicated through multiple channels, including public statements and diplomatic communications. The administration has specifically cited national security concerns related to critical mineral supply chains and Arctic access routes. Canadian officials have acknowledged receiving these communications but have not confirmed any active negotiations with China on comprehensive trade agreements. China has maintained its standard position of supporting multilateral trade relationships while avoiding specific commitments regarding Canadian partnerships. The tariff mechanism itself would operate through existing presidential authorities under national security provisions. These powers allow for rapid implementation without requiring congressional approval, creating immediate economic consequences. The scope encompasses all categories of Canadian exports, including energy products that represent the largest component of bilateral trade. Current trade volume suggests such measures would affect approximately $400 billion in annual commerce, representing roughly 20% of total Canadian economic output. The strategic context behind this position centers on multiple structural factors that have evolved significantly over the past decade. The United States views Canada as a critical buffer in North American continental defense, particularly regarding Arctic approaches and early warning systems. This geographic reality has shaped bilateral defense cooperation for over 70 years through NORD and other integrated command structures. The relationship encompasses shared radar systems, joint air patrols, and coordinated missile defense protocols that assume Canadian territory remains under Western strategic control. The second factor involves critical mineral supply chains essential for defense and technology sectors. Canada controls significant deposits of rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, and other materials that both the United States and China consider strategically vital. These resources have become increasingly important as military systems rely more heavily on advanced electronics, and as civilian technology requires sophisticated battery systems. The concentration of these materials in geologically stable, politically reliable locations provides significant strategic advantages to powers that can secure exclusive or preferential access. The third factor relates to Arctic shipping routes and resource extraction rights, where melting ice has created new possibilities for both economic exploitation and military positioning. Climate change has accelerated ice loss in Arctic regions, opening previously impassable shipping lanes that could reduce transit times between Asian and European markets by thousands of miles. These routes pass through Canadian territorial waters and could provide China with alternative shipping corridors that bypass traditional choke points controlled by American allies. The fourth dimension involves cybersecurity and telecommunications infrastructure, where Chinese technology companies have sought partnerships with Canadian firms and government entities. The United States has consistently opposed Chinese involvement in critical communications networks, viewing such arrangements as potential security vulnerabilities. Canadian telecommunications infrastructure connects directly to American networks, creating shared vulnerabilities that affect both countries' national security systems. The core analytical question revolves around how trade policy serves broader geopolitical objectives in an era of strategic competition. Trump's approach represents a departure from traditional alliance management, where economic and security relationships operated through separate channels with different decision-making processes. The integration of trade threats with security concerns creates a more direct but also more volatile framework for managing partnership relationships. This approach assumes that economic leverage can effectively shape strategic choices by allied nations, even when those choices involve third-party relationships. The mechanism behind this policy operates through asymmetric economic dependence that has developed over decades of continental economic integration. Canada exports approximately $400 billion worth of goods to the United States annually, representing roughly 20% of Canadian GDP and supporting millions of Canadian jobs. This dependency creates significant vulnerability to trade disruptions, particularly in energy and commodity sectors where alternative markets cannot easily absorb Canadian production volumes at comparable prices. The United States leverages this asymmetry to influence Canadian foreign policy choices beyond traditional security cooperation frameworks. The energy sector represents the largest component of this economic relationship, with Canadian oil, natural gas, and electricity comprising roughly 60% of bilateral trade value. These energy flows have created integrated infrastructure systems including pipelines, transmission lines, and processing facilities that span the border. Disruption of these systems would affect both countries but would impose proportionally greater costs on Canada due to limited alternative export markets and the specialized nature of energy infrastructure investments. The key variable here is often overlooked. The success of this approach depends on Canada's assessment of Chinese economic opportunities versus American trade security. If China offers sufficiently attractive terms for long-term resource partnerships, including infrastructure investment and guaranteed purchase agreements, the calculation could shift despite short-term American tariff threats. This creates a dynamic where both powers compete not just for access to Canadian resources, but for exclusive partnership arrangements that deny strategic materials to competitors. Chinese investment in Canadian resource sectors has already established significant precedents through acquisitions of energy companies, mining operations, and infrastructure projects. These investments provide China with direct access to Canadian resources while creating economic relationships that could complicate future policy decisions. The presence of Chinese capital in Canadian strategic sectors gives China influence over production decisions and creates constituencies within Canada that benefit from continued Chinese partnership. This creates a constraint that shapes everything next. The policy forces Canada into a binary choice structure where maintaining full access to American markets requires avoiding significant economic integration with China. This constraint operates beyond specific trade agreements to encompass broader technology sharing, infrastructure development, and resource extraction partnerships. The implications extend to Arctic development projects, where Chinese investment could provide necessary capital for resource extraction in remote and expensive operating environments. The Arctic development dimension adds particular complexity because of the enormous capital requirements for extraction and transportation infrastructure in harsh environments. Traditional Western investors have often avoided Arctic projects due to high costs, long payback periods, and environmental risks. Chinese state-backed companies operate under different financial constraints and strategic timeframes, potentially making them more willing to invest in projects that Western companies consider economically marginal. Now, the second-order effect is where it gets interesting. The policy potentially drives Canada toward closer integration with American supply chains and defense industrial cooperation. If successful, this approach could create a North American economic bloc with enhanced strategic autonomy regarding critical materials and Arctic access. Current cooperation includes shared production of certain weapons systems and coordinated research and development programs. Enhanced integration could involve Canadian participation in American defense supply chains for critical minerals processing and advanced manufacturing, potentially providing Canada with access to American defense markets while ensuring reliable supply sources for American military requirements. The enforcement mechanism relies on trade dependency rather than formal security agreements. Unlike traditional alliance structures that operate through institutional frameworks and shared threat assessments, this approach uses immediate economic consequences to shape partner behavior. The effectiveness depends on maintaining credible threats while avoiding actual implementation that could damage both economies. This requires careful calibration between pressure and partnership maintenance, particularly given the integrated nature of North American supply chains. The implementation challenges are significant because of the interconnected nature of North American economic systems. Many American companies depend on Canadian inputs for their production processes, while Canadian companies rely on American markets for their revenue. Tariff implementation could disrupt these relationships and impose costs on American businesses and consumers, potentially creating domestic political opposition to the policy. The administration must balance pressure on Canada against potential domestic economic consequences. The precedent-setting implications extend beyond the Canada-China relationship to broader alliance management strategies. If successful, this approach could be applied to other allied countries facing choices between American and Chinese economic partnerships. European allies, Asian partners, and Latin American countries all face similar decisions regarding Chinese investment and trade relationships, making the Canadian case a potential template for future American policy. We can identify three plausible scenarios based on current structural factors and stated positions. The baseline scenario involves Canada maintaining current trade relationships with both powers while avoiding comprehensive agreements with China that would trigger American tariff responses. This outcome requires continued Chinese patience with limited Canadian engagement and American acceptance of existing bilateral trade volumes. Canadian policy would focus on maintaining access to American markets while pursuing selective engagement with China in areas deemed less sensitive by American security assessments.
Early indicators for this scenario include Canadian statements emphasizing balanced relationships and adherence to American security concerns in telecommunications and critical infrastructure sectors, Chinese restraint in pushing for exclusive partnerships and willingness to accept limited Canadian engagement would support this outcome. American acceptance of existing Chinese investments in Canadian resource sectors without demanding their reversal would indicate tolerance for the status quo arrangement. The escalation scenario emerges if Canada pursues significant economic integration with China despite American threats. This could occur if Chinese offers become economically compelling enough to outweigh American market access, or if Canadian domestic politics shift towards supporting economic diversification away from American dependence. The trigger could be a major Chinese infrastructure investment offer, comprehensive trade agreement proposals, or Canadian assessment that American demands represent unacceptable constraints on sovereign decisions. Implementation of 100% tariffs would severely disrupt North American supply chains and force both countries to develop alternative economic relationships. Canada would need to accelerate diversification toward Asian and European markets, while managing significant short-term economic disruption. The United States would face increased costs for Canadian inputs and potential supply shortages in energy and raw materials sectors. Both countries would experience reduced economic efficiency and higher consumer prices. Indicators for this path include formal Canadian-Chinese infrastructure agreements, particularly in Arctic development or critical mineral sectors. American implementation of preliminary tariff measures or explicit ultimatums would signal movement toward escalation. Canadian domestic political support for economic diversification and public opinion polling showing reduced concern about American economic retaliation would indicate domestic political feasibility for this path. The integration scenario involves deeper North American economic cooperation that satisfies American strategic concerns while providing Canada with enhanced market access and development support. This outcome requires American willingness to offer positive incentives alongside threatened penalties and Canadian assessment that benefits outweigh constraints on Chinese relationships. The framework could involve preferential treatment for Canadian products in American markets, joint infrastructure development projects, and expanded cooperation in emerging technology sectors. Key indicators include joint Arctic development announcements that provide alternative funding sources for Canadian resource projects, expanded defense industrial cooperation agreements that give Canadian companies greater access to American defense markets would support this scenario. Enhanced research and development partnerships in critical technology areas could provide Canada with advanced manufacturing opportunities while ensuring American access to Canadian resources and expertise. Each scenario carries distinct implications for global supply chain organization and strategic competition patterns. The baseline maintains current competitive dynamics while potentially increasing tensions over marginal decisions and creating uncertainty for long-term investment planning. Both American and Chinese companies face continued ambiguity about the scope of permissible Canadian partnerships, potentially discouraging investment in sectors deemed strategically sensitive. Escalation could fragment North American economic integration while strengthening Chinese resource access in the region. This outcome would force both American and Canadian companies to restructure supply chains and develop alternative partnerships, imposing significant transition costs on both economies. Chinese success in maintaining Canadian partnerships despite American opposition could encourage other countries to resist similar American pressure, potentially weakening the effectiveness of economic leverage as a policy tool. Integration would enhance Western strategic autonomy in critical materials and Arctic access while potentially accelerating Chinese efforts to develop alternative supply sources and shipping routes. This outcome could strengthen the overall Western position in strategic competition, but might also increase Chinese motivation to secure partnerships with other resource-rich countries and develop technological alternatives to materials currently controlled by Western allies. Our analysis reveals several confirmed patterns and remaining uncertainties. The linkage between trade policy and national security concerns represents a measurable shift in American alliance management strategy that moves beyond traditional institutional frameworks toward direct economic coercion. The economic asymmetries that enable this approach are well documented and create predictable pressure points for Canadian, though the long-term sustainability of such pressure remains unclear. The strategic importance of Arctic resources and shipping routes provides clear motivation for both American defensive positioning and Chinese expansion efforts, with climate change accelerating the timeline for practical access to these resources. However, significant uncertainty remains regarding several critical factors. Chinese willingness to accept constraints on Canadian partnerships versus escalating competition for Canadian resources remains unclear. Canadian domestic political tolerance for binary choice structures imposed by external powers could shift. Depending on economic performance and public opinion regarding sovereignty concerns, the effectiveness of trade threats in shaping alliance behavior represents a largely untested approach with unclear long-term consequences for partnership stability and alliance cohesion. The broader implications for alliance management and strategic competition extend beyond the immediate Canada-China-America triangle. Other allied countries face similar choices regarding Chinese economic partnerships, making the resolution of this case potentially precedent-setting for global alliance structures. The integration of economic and security policies represents a broader trend toward comprehensive national power competition that affects multiple regions and relationships. We will continue tracking confirmed policy implementations and official statements as they develop. The interaction between trade leverage and strategic competition provides insight into broader patterns of great power competition in resource-rich regions. If you have access to official statements or verified policy documents, they contribute to understanding these evolving dynamics